What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be finishing our updated rankings. We've gone through, done the quarterbacks, the running backs, the wide receivers. Today is going to be my top 20 tight ends here for Dynasty Fantasy Football Leagues. If this is your first time at the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We just passed 5K, so thank you to everybody who has been supporting this channel. It means a ton to me. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about some tight ends. All right, so as you can see, I got 7 tiers pulled up on the tier maker. To get through today's list, we're going to be starting it off in tier 1 at the number 1 guy, and I have 2 players in this tier. It's no surprise to anybody. It's Brock Bowers and Trey McBride. Look, both of these players obviously deserve to be in this tier. Trey McBride last year averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game. Brock Bowers averaged 15.5 fantasy points per game. That is in your full PPR formats. Both of these players are 25 years of age or younger. Obviously, Brock Bowers still going into his second year of his career, and Trey McBride just signing one of the largest tight end contracts in NFL history. I don't think we need to talk too much about those players. These guys are very elite tight end assets, and these are the only 2 players that I think are at the tight end position that are worth spending up for. Everybody else, I'm not really spending up to get them, only these 2 players. Now going into tier 2, I do have one player in a tier of his own. It's going to be number 3 for me, Sam LaPorta. Sam LaPorta at 24 years old, a little bit of a down year last year, obviously had the very good rookie season, was in the tier 1 last year. Then he came out this year, a little bit of touchdown regression. We did say that might be in the range of outcomes. He scored 10.9 fantasy points per game. Obviously still in the Detroit Lions offense, this time with no Ben Johnson. I don't think it's going to affect him too much. I think that Lions offense is still going to be one of the best offenses in the NFL, but his age and that rookie season still has him in a tier of his own for me. There are a couple guys that I think are going to be similar producers to him over the next couple of years. We'll talk about them in tier 2, but the age, being 24 years old, as young as he is, going into year 3, I think that should be a reason why he is in the tier of his own. Now going into tier 3, I do have those 2 guys. It's going to be TJ Hockenson for me and George Kittle. Last year, George Kittle averaged 15.8 fantasy points per game. That is some of the highest in the NFL. Obviously, they lose Deebo Samuel. They're going to be relying on Ricky Pearsall to step up in that offense, and George Kittle should have a very productive last couple years of his career. The problem is he's going to be 32 years old this season. Obviously, that is much older at the tight end position. You have guys like Kelce who are 35, guys like Engram who are 30, obviously guys like Mark Andrews who are going to be 30 as well. These players, despite being producers, probably have to move down the rankings, because when we're drafting these players in startups, we can't project a long period of time where they're going to be super productive, and obviously the age cliff always hits when it hits. It's unfortunate when it happens, but I do think George Kittle still should be considered a top 5 tight end, probably one of the most disrespected players to buy in the trade market right now, because I've seen him go for very cheap. If you're a contending roster, you should probably be buying. And then TJ Hockenson, to me, last year wasn't a good year coming off of the ACL. Obviously, he wasn't fully healthy. He's still 27 years old, going to be 28 this year. That offense in Minnesota is about as good as it gets in football. I think TJ Hockenson is going to have a bounce back here this year, and he's a player that we should still be relying on in Dynasty. I wouldn't be shocked if a year from now he comes out, has a good season with JJ McCarthy. We're talking about him back up in that tier 2 with Sam LaPorta. So I think he's a player that can move up. Obviously, he's not super old yet right now. 28 isn't young, it's not old, but it's kind of right there on the edge. I do think that TJ Hockenson should be a top 5 guy, and for me, he's the 4th tight end that I'd be drafting off the board in my startups. Let's go to tier 4. Tier 4 is the last of those tight ends that I think we can consider cornerstone tight ends, if you even consider tight ends as cornerstones. My own personal philosophy with the tight end position is if I don't have one of these top 5 guys, one of the top 3 guys even, I'm probably just punting the position later, because there's so much value to be had later, and the difference between the tight end 6, 7, 8 in Dynasty and the difference between 14, 15, 16 isn't massive. So that's usually my theory. But let's go into tier 4, because I do believe that these players are still very worthy of being drafted highly-ish in your Dynasty startups. Those players are going to be Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland, Dalton Kincaid, and Tucker Kraft. Now, the reason why I think this tier is still going to be one that people go highly after is because of the age of these guys. Obviously, Warren and Loveland being rookies, 23 and 21 years old, Kincaid being 25 years old, Kraft being 24 years old. These are still the young guys that can kind of have that upside, that breakout potential. None of these players are going to be off of the rookie contract. Obviously, some of them are just starting in the NFL. I like Loveland and Warren's draft capital. I had Warren over Loveland in my pre-draft rankings. After the NFL draft, still had Warren over Loveland just based off of the talent. I think both of those players are fine to build around. And then Kincaid, down year, didn't get the breakout that we expected. That can still happen in year 3. I don't think it's necessarily dead end for Dalton Kincaid right now, but he's a better receiver than he is a pass blocker, and that is keeping him off of the football field. And I think that's something to consider. Tucker Kraft last year, 24 years old, 9.6 fantasy points per game, probably the best scorer in this tier. And that was in an offense that obviously was lacking some pass catchers or established pass catchers. They added a guy like Matthew Golden. Luke Musgrave is a little bit healthier this year. There are some things to consider with this Green Bay offense where there's going to be days where somebody's going off and somebody's being left out. I don't know if Tucker Kraft is going to have some consistency that we want, but most of these tight ends don't have consistency anyways. At the end of the day, he's still a top 10 guy for me. I'm taking him as my tight end 9. And like I said, this tier of younger tight ends is probably the last tier that I feel super optimistic about building around moving forward. Now, moving on to my tier 5, this is where I really stop caring about age, youth, and really start to focus in on the production, because I think most of these players you can probably look at as 1 to 2 year windows. I want to get as many fantasy points as possible, so I'm going to be a little bit higher, I think, than consensus on some of these players. I'm not going to fade them because they're old. My tier 5 for me is going to be Mark Andrews 10, going to be David Njoku 11, Evan Engram 12, and 13 is Travis Kelce. I hear it, a lot of people are going to say I'm not drafting those guys over XYZ. At the end of the day, Mark Andrews, 29 years old, averaged 11.1 fantasy points per game. That's more than everybody in the tier above him. David Njoku, 29 years old, averaged 13.5 fantasy points per game, more than everybody in the tier above him. Evan Engram, same thing. Travis Kelce, same thing. Now, I know these players are older. We're not going to be able to project long-term outlooks for them. Mark Andrews has had some trade rumblings. I don't think he's necessarily going to be traded, but this could be his last year in Baltimore because I do believe he is a free agent at the end of this year. Don't fact check me on that, but I think that is what is happening with Mark Andrews' contract. David Njoku, I have him behind Mark Andrews because of the quarterback situation there. Evan Engram, 30 years old. Think he's going to be the Joker for Sean Payton. Should be a very good fantasy tight end for us this year. Problem is it just going to be 1 or 2 seasons? I don't know. And then Travis Kelce, despite as much as everybody wants to fade him, despite as much as he is being disrespected in the trade market, still one of the highest scoring fantasy tight ends last year, and everybody seems to have written him off for dead. Nobody wants him. If you're trying to trade away Travis Kelce, I've had dynasty leagues where people won't even give me a second. People have said, hey, maybe I'll just give you a 3rd round pick. Fuck that. Travis Kelce is going to be productive. I think he is being disrespected, and even though he's my tight end 13, that is only because he is going to be 36 years old and has pondered retirement already. But as a producer, again, just like George Kittle, should be one of the most productive veteran buys, alongside guys like Engram and Mark Andrews in this tier as well. So let's go to tier 6. These are players that are a little bit younger, but also probably not going to be as productive as the guys above them, but still also probably have that murky long-term outlook as well. You can't really project the next couple of seasons for these guys, but I'm definitely willing to roster them and roster a couple of these players if I don't have one of the top tight ends. That is going to be Kyle Pitts. People are going to be very upset about that. I'll talk about it. Jake Ferguson at 15, 16 Pat Freiermuth, and 17 is Isaiah Likely. For me, Kyle Pitts has done nothing in his career so far to establish himself as somebody who needs to be in that Tucker Kraft tier, to be somebody on my Dynasty Fantasy Football team who's going to be more valuable than a guy like Mark Andrews or a guy like David Njoku or a guy like Travis Kelce when I know those guys are going to give me double-digit fantasy points per game. Kyle Pitts hasn't done that. Last year, 24 years old, 7.7 fantasy points per game. He was drafted to be this generational tight end. He just hasn't been up to this point, and quite honestly, you could argue that a guy like Pat Freiermuth, who was drafted in his draft class with him, has been equally as productive throughout their entire rookie contracts as each other, despite neither of them being in a good fantasy football environment. And you could argue that Pitts is in the better fantasy football environment for fantasy points right now over the last couple of seasons. Even last year, Pitts, being where he was, did not outscore Pat Freiermuth. Freiermuth was 9.9 fantasy points per game. All of these players are 24, 25, 26 years old. It's not like they're old. It just feels like, to me, I've seen enough out of Kyle Pitts to know that that ceiling, that mythical, magical ceiling of upside that a lot of people think that he possesses, might not actually exist. And it probably doesn't exist here in Atlanta because we've had 3 or 4 years here now where it hasn't existed at all. You could kind of throw out one of the years where he was hurt, but it hasn't existed in Atlanta, so it's probably not going to happen. A lot of people think it is. He's still ranked in the top 8, 9 9, 10 players in most people's dynasty tight end rankings. I think a lot of that is because he's still young and he still has this pre-draft bias where a lot of people still believe he has the magical ceiling. To me, he doesn't. I haven't seen it, and I know that's going to probably make some people a little bit upset. The Kyle Pitts truthers, they are strong, they're out there. I just don't see it, and I don't think he's much of a difference maker on my dynasty fantasy football teams, and I don't think he makes a bigger difference than guys like Ferguson, Freiermuth likely do moving forward. So Ferguson's another player in this tier. Last year, obviously Dak Prescott being out, he only averaged 7.5 fantasy points per game, but he has been good for us in fantasy football before, giving us a top 10, top 12 type of season. I think he can have another good year this year. You add the target competition in George Pickens, that does kind of break him down my rankings. I think last year at this point in time, I kind of had him closer to David Njoku. Now I have him down in a tier below just because of the added competition. And then likely, as long as Mark Andrews is there, he's not going to be able to move up these rankings, but you've seen flashes. He gets the coach speak. I think a lot of people are excited about Isaiah Likely. I'm here to say let's just pump the brakes, but as soon as Mark Andrews is out of town, if and when that happens, I think Likely can bounce up pretty quickly into that David Njoku tier, maybe with a good year and no added extra competition into that Tucker Kraft, Dalton, Kincaid, Colston, Loveland, Tyler Warren type of tier. So he's a player that if you want to buy low on right now, where people are kind of not thinking about him, I think there are some people that are thinking about him. Maybe I'm lower than consensus, but if people are not thinking about him, you can buy low and maybe get a guy who can shoot up rankings if Mark Andrews leaves Baltimore. And then my last and final tier, this is going to be a tier of 3 players. I got Mason Taylor at 18, 19 Jonnu Smith, and 20 is Cade Otton. Mason Taylor being the rookie, it's going to be interesting to see how he pairs here with Justin Fields. I liked him as my tight end 3 in this class. I think he has the potential to go out and do some really good things for fantasy football teams. It's going to just come down to, is Justin Fields able to move the football around as much? And I don't know if that's the case. He may be a little bit of a slower burn in dynasty fantasy football leagues. Jonnu last year, 13 fantasy points per game. I hope to see that carry over this year. I don't know if it will. It's kind of, an outlier year for the most part in Jonnu Smith's career, but he should be a player that is also kind of a value in dynasty fantasy football leagues if you're a contending roster, and we'll see what happens with Tyreek Hill moving forward. Cade Otton at 26 years old, 10 fantasy points per game. He was higher in my rankings this time last year, was also higher in my rankings I think when I did this just a few months ago, but since then, obviously you've kind of had the Jalen McMillan breakout, you've had Emeka Egbuka get added to the offense, and then they've re-signed Chris Godwin. They're just bringing in a lot of pass catchers, and I don't like targeting tight ends that have that many receivers in the offense that are going to be competing for targets with them, so that's why Cade Otton is still here. But 10 fantasy points per game at 26 years old, there's definitely a lot worse options that you could have, so Cade Otton is a fine, good, not great type of tight end option with a lot of target competition, and that rounds out my top 20. Now, I know tight ends aren't necessarily the most interesting, it's not the most fun to talk about. They are crucial for us in fantasy football leagues at times, especially if you're in a tight end premium league, so having guys like Andrews, Njoku, Engram, Kelce, Ferguson, those guys be talked about. It is beneficial if you play in those types of leagues. So hopefully you guys did enjoy today's video. Hopefully you don't hate the Kyle Pitts rating too much, but I think I'm being more of a realist than I am an optimist with him at this point in time. If you like the content, make sure you hit the like button. It is the best free way to support this channel. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed. Like I said at the beginning of the video, we passed 5K on our way to 10. Hopefully you guys are going to be a part of the journey. And last but not least, make sure you go join our free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with our Dynasty Fantasy Football teams 24/7, 365, and a dope community of people there. I think we're getting close to 500 people in that Discord, so make sure you go join it. Like I said, free to join, no risk in doing that. But with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.